and from Matthew 22, verses 34 to 40. When the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" he said to him. "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets."
Thank you, Paul and Carolyn. It's not surprising when we stop and think about our culture that one of the strongest elements of our culture is the me first focus. That everything revolves around me. We see this so vividly illustrated in the current president of the United States, Donald Trump, that everything seems to revolve around himself. He doesn't seem to care about the COVID pandemic or other struggles in the US. No, it's just about what makes him look good. And of course, it's one reason why in America there is a very different approach to COVID than there is in this country, because Americans like to be independent and not be told what to do. So things like mask wearing isn't compulsory. It's kind of, if I feel like it, I will. And so the culture there is all about what I want to do, what's best for me and how I view the world. And that, of course, means that some issues, such as COVID in America, don't get addressed because everyone is off doing their own thing. It's why, I suspect, we struggle to see much action on climate change, because if it doesn't affect me directly right now, then I'm not so interested, and our politicians aren't so interested. Or the people like refugees and asylum seekers. They don't affect me, they don't affect how I live, so I'll just close my eyes and pretend that they aren't there and just get on with my life. The scriptures, of course, paint a very different story to that. Rather than the world revolving around me, the scriptures say that life begins and ends with God. That God is the starting point for our life and our reflections on life. So if you think to how the scriptures are even structured, they begin with Genesis. And in Genesis, it's God who speaks the first word, and there is light, and there is life. And the scriptures continue in that vein right until the very closing chapter of the book of Revelation, where everything again is centered on God and God's light and goodness and love. So the scriptures make it quite clear that that is the right order to approach life. Not focus on ourselves, but focus first and foremost on God, who is the creator, who is the redeemer, who is the sustainer. So when Jesus is asked this question by the lawyer, what is the first and greatest commandment in the law? And by the way, this was not just a friendly little discussion between Jesus and the lawyer. We're told that this was another trap. This was another test that Jesus was being subjected to. And this time it's a Pharisee who sets the trap. And in some ways that's not surprising, because Jesus and the Pharisees have history when it comes to the law. There's been these long-running skirmishes right through the ministry of Jesus between his interpretation of the law and the Pharisees' interpretation of the law. So they've had run-ins about Sabbath regulations, what you can do on the Sabbath, whether you can heal, whether you can pluck grain. They've had run-ins on purity laws, how to wash hands, how to prepare for meals, whether you fast or not. So they've had several run-ins with Jesus about the law. And I suspect that's why in the Sermon on the Mount you have that portion where Jesus says, "Don't think that I come to abolish the law." So presumably that was an accusation being made against Jesus, that he was so light-handed with the law and about Sabbath regulations that he didn't really care about the Jewish law. He'd even come to abolish it. Not so, says Jesus. You just have to read it the right way and prioritize it the right way. So when he's put on the spot and says, "Well, what is the greatest commandment, Jesus?" he comes out with a very standard Orthodox Jewish response. And he quotes from a prayer that is prayed by Jewish people even today, the beginning of the day, the middle of the day, and the end of the day. That prayer is called the Shema, which is based on the first word in Hebrew of this prayer, which is the word hear. And it comes from Deuteronomy, and it's, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength." So that's a very orthodox response from Jesus. And I imagine the lawyer going, "Yeah, thumbs up, that's a good response, Jesus. Of course, that's the most important part of the law." And we might like to pause and think, how do we go about loving God with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength? And we do that in different ways. And we might like to reflect on that further. Are we giving God our best worship? Are we spending some time each day in prayer? Or are we opening our Bibles to read the Word of God to us? Are we loving God in how we treat other people? There are lots of ways that we can love God. And of course, it's not just the Jewish people who want to place God first and foremost. We might think of the Lord's Prayer, which is the most common Christian prayer that we all know and we usually pray when we gather for worship like this. And that, of course, begins again with a focus on God. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So again, the focus is fairly and squarely on God initially. But of course, our lives aren't only about God, because if they were, we'd be so heavenly minded we wouldn't be any earthly good, as the saying goes. So God is interested and concerned in how we live. And again, the scriptures are very clear that there's not a focus on the individual as much as there is a focus on community. Nearly everything in the scriptures is angled towards the life of the community of faith, whether that's Israel, whether that's the church. So there is this focus then, how we treat other people, how we live in relationship with other people. And Jesus therefore adds to this commandment to love God with heart, soul, mind and strength, and says, well, there's a second commandment that's like that, and that's to love your neighbour as you love yourself. Now, we read a few extra verses from the chapter in Leviticus from which that statement comes, because it's often just pulled out as this part little verse, well, we're to love our neighbour. But the setting in Leviticus actually suggests to us what that might look like. It says that we're not to treat the poor with injustice and sort of pander to the needs of the rich and the great. We're not to have any form of hate towards our neighbour. And we might recall again Jesus' teaching, it has been told to you that you shall love your neighbour but hate your enemy. And Jesus goes on to explain that no, actually you're called to love even your enemy. Later in the chapter, the neighbour may extend to the foreigner living in your midst. You're also to love the foreigner living among you as you love yourself. So this command to love your neighbour is actually fairly broad. So when we think about how we might want to be treated and what sort of justice, what sort of compassion, what sort of love and care we might want others to show towards us, Jesus says, well, treat others in that way. So again, we might think of that verse from the Sermon on the Mount, which is the so-called golden rule: do to others as you would have them do to you. And this way of living, of course, is not some philosophical reflection on this is the best way to live, although there have been throughout history plenty of philosophers who've mused on that subject. But no, the reason we are to love our neighbour is that reflects God's love for us and for our neighbour. So Jesus says, back to the lawyer, these are the two important commandments: love God and love your neighbour. And where the first of these teachings might have got the thumbs up from the Pharisee, yes, you've got to love God, of course. The second one was more testing for the Pharisees, because their approach was to draw tight boundaries around who was acceptable to God, who was loved by God. And in the eyes of the Pharisees, it was those who kept the Sabbath rules, who kept the purity laws, and it certainly excluded people like tax collectors and prostitutes and foreigners and lepers and all the sorts of people that Jesus was drawn to, and who in turn were drawn to Jesus. So I think that was a big challenge here to the Pharisees and of course to us, to think about, who is my neighbour? Who is the one that I'm called to love? And for the Pharisees, it was a small, tight circle of people, whereas for Jesus, it was an expansive, inclusive group of people. When this story is told in Luke's Gospel, the lawyer has a follow-up question around this issue. And the lawyer says, well, Jesus, who is my neighbour? And Jesus goes on and tells the parable of the Good Samaritan and says, well, the one who is the good neighbour is the one who crosses the boundaries, the one who goes that extra step, that extra mile to look after their neighbour. So all of this we probably know. We've heard it dozens of times in church. It's part of our Christian DNA, if you like, that of course we love God and we love our neighbour. The question then is how? How do we do it? If we know this is the call, how do we go about doing it? And the scriptures and psychologists would tell us that it all starts with what goes on up here, with, well, yeah, what we think and what goes on in our hearts, our heart attitude, and that desire to do good, to help, to connect with people, to bring healing and wholeness to people. And if that attitude is right, then it will overflow in our words and our actions. Sometimes that love will be very costly. Jesus does say elsewhere that if you want to be my followers, you need to take up your cross and follow me. We see that in the life of Jesus himself, of course, that his love for others, his love for neighbour, ultimately ended up with him laying down his life for us. So this idea of love can be very costly. When we think of love, we might think of some of the passages in the Apostle Paul. We might think of passages used at weddings, for instance, love is patient, love is kind passage from 1 Corinthians 13. We might think of passages in Galatians where Paul talks about the fruit of the Spirit and love and joy and peace and kindness and gentleness, self-control. And he concludes that list by saying, against such things there is no law. And one of the amazing things about this teaching of Jesus is that it is memorable, it's simple, it's positive, but it's also very open-ended. He doesn't say, this is exactly how you're to love in this situation. There are no limits. There are no conditions. And that is one of the beauties of this teaching, that it is up to each of us in every situation that we face today and tomorrow and during the week. How will we love God? How will we love our neighbour as ourselves? How will we bring that compassion and care? How will we bring generosity and kindness and grace to our neighbour? And why will we do this? Because it reflects God's love for us. It's why we have ministries like Helping Hand. It's why we run a playgroup where all are invited. It's why we've run Drop-In, where everybody is welcome. It's why we've run, when we were able to, community lunches each week at Croydon North, where again, everybody was invited to come and receive a meal, to be accepted as part of community. It's part of how we love our neighbour. And I know lots of you do this in lots of other ways as well. So it's time for me to stop, I think. But perhaps what I could encourage you to think about is, with this commandment of Jesus to love God with all of ourselves and to love our neighbour as ourselves, maybe there's parts of that you find easy. Perhaps there are parts of that you find much harder, much more challenging. Then I would encourage you to spend some time reflecting and talking to God in prayer, the parts that you struggle with more, and receive some encouragement from God. Because one of the other teachings around this whole topic of love that is like so central in our New Testament is that we have the capacity to love others because God has poured God's Spirit into our hearts. That is how we can do it. It's not gritting our teeth. It's not deciding, oh, I've got to love so much today. No, it's because God is transforming our lives and our hearts through God's Spirit at work, that we are then able to reflect God's love and kindness and grace to others. Amen.